everything, I'm sorry, I'm tired. That everything that stems from blackness equals death or social death. And when you start from a place where everything about us is death, there's nowhere to go. There's nowhere to go. And this is why it's faulty. This is why I think it's lazy. This is why I think it is shallow. Um, because it doesn't allow us complexity. It doesn't allow us to be generative, which I believe Black horror is. It doesn't allow us to make the connections with our ancestors that I'm sure Dr. Abegunde is going to expand upon. um there is life within this, and some of the trauma is there. There's a realness there, but we also have the safe space created by horror to experience some of these things from our couch or from our computer screen, or we have the removal that horror allows us to have. And so we can explore the idea, Dr. Chesia Burke's idea that horror is not a safe space, but we also must contend with the idea that Black horror does not mean Black trauma, does not mean Black death. And I just like to start there.
Thank you. Does anyone else like to expand on that? Thank you. Yeah, Black trauma. That's a lot.
Yeah, no, for real. Yeah, I guess I could chime in too. There's so many thoughts because when I read the question, the thesis question, so many things. Yeah, because okay, so I think that that maybe, and this is coming from like a media perspective too, as far as like the critiques around how we're consuming these particular images too. I mean, we're in a binging culture, right now too. And I think that as the young folks say, it hits different these days because of how we consume the images. And there's also this, what do you call it? This vacuum that has to be filled by, social media and how we consume horror. Because a lot of times, it's consumed private. It was consumed privately, in a certain sense, or it's like it's this kind of dark secret that we would, that we like these kind of types of stories. I think also that there's maybe like a lack of appreciation for the genre, of horror and the mechanics of how monstrosity and trauma are used in that particular genre. I think to me, like, well, trauma is actually even parts of the steps of horror, because you have like, I mean, as far as like just how the spectrum of it, how it unfolds, as far as like how affect is dealt with in that particular area. Because we start with dread, which is like the impending trauma, like, you're about to watch something horrible, something horrible is about to happen. And then of course there's terror, which is like the fear of physical abuse or physical harm. Then there's a trauma. Some type of trauma happens, like whether it's physical or like depictions of physicality, or mental trauma. And then of course there's there's also repulsion, which is earlier actually. That's a physical reaction to the thing that's about to happen. So it's like in like horror movies and stuff, when people are like clutching their pearls, or or like throwing up, or like smelling something that's actually like impending. It's a physical response to something that's horrible, right? And then of course there's horror, which is more about the mental affect after the horrible thing is happening, which is like the thing that sits with you. And I think that dealing with some of those like reified instances of horror can be very useful, but then it's according to taste too. Some people don't like horror as a genre. I love the genre, since I was a kid actually, and find it very useful and cathartic in different ways. The other thing too is like, I don't know, I find like the word pornography to be like, I think it's kind of like hyperbolic in a sense, because essentially like pornography to me, it doesn't have emotion, it doesn't have value, because it's just happening. And I think that people utilize it in different ways to project what's going on with it. I think the thing that definitely like separates pornography from art in a certain sense is intent. you know. And sometimes those particular intents are executed well, and sometimes the executions are off. The other thing too is I think that they might be like, some people, of course, there's a lot of people who are writing about these pieces who are extremely, you know, well educated in media production, but I think a lot of people also are not, you know, privy to like how these things are created as well, you know, as far as like just how many hands are on projects, you know. So I try to take into account all the different like variables as far as like production side of stuff too. But I definitely don't agree that, you know, them and Lovecraft Country are pornographic in that way, because they are deploying techniques that have been used in horror movies since the beginning, as far as like practical effects and shot selections and, you know, the type of emotional affect that they're trying to achieve. I do think that with you know, this kind of like new renaissance of Black horror, you know, or as Robert Mead Coleman talks about, like Black horror films, but also horror with Black people in them, you know, that we do have like more of a spectrum of experiences to encounter now, which I'm actually kind of grateful for, to kind of borrow from Janelle Hobson's post the other day. Like, let's celebrate the fact that we have all these different pieces that we can look at now, you know. Yeah, and so those are some of my initial thoughts about it. I don't know if I answered your question at all, but I definitely don't agree that after looking at all these different things, I'm still more traumatized by, you know, Judas and the Black Messiah, you know, which I thought was a phenomenal film, but, you know, the amount of like physical reaction I had to it and pain, and actually I literally had a headache for 2 hours after watching it because I was so angry at what I had seen. So it's like, I think it's a taste thing, and I still feel more traumatized by The Help personally than the thing. Yeah, we can talk about that later if you want to, you know. And also too, I think, you know, it's a personal where it's like, you know, I've experienced a lot of, you know, trauma, you know, coming up, you know, a Black man in the South, you know, and both physical and other ways too. So I think it's also a personal aspect. But I'm gonna stop talking. How about that? I'm gonna stop.
Oh no, that's just now, because we coming back. Abegunde and Susana, you had any thoughts?
Susana, I saw you unmuted before I did. Would you like to go? Then I'll go after you.
Sure. That sounds great. Yeah, I want to sort of, you just mentioned something, John, about Janelle Hobson's post on social media about this sort of, you know, embarrassment of riches that we have now, but we're still dealing with, in terms of our criticism, a mindset of scarcity, right? So, you know, I recall at the turn of the century, we had, you know, I wrote a piece about the sort of issue that we had at the turn of the century for Regina Bradley's upcoming book on Outcast, about the film that they did, Idlewild, and so how it's sort of Afrofuturist. And in that piece, I was just thinking of how at the turn of the 21st century, we moved away from the hood films in the United States. We moved away from the Black rom-coms, the sort of cis-het Black rom-coms. And then we went headfirst into Tyler Perry land, right? Into the adaptations of the stage plays, which are inferior to the stage plays, right? And it's a particular genre of film and of art that dominated that decade, right? And there were some art house films and things of that nature. And we also on television get a whole bunch of reality TV, right? Which can be great and fun, but it's not the place that we're in right now where you can watch Bad Girls Club Reunion Atlanta, Real Housewives of Atlanta, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You can watch Malcolm and Marie. You can watch If Beale Street Could Talk. You can watch Lovecraft Country. You can watch Tyler's still out here working at BET doing everything, right? There is a plethora of things in a variety of genres, but we're still sort of behaving as if we have two shows and we have to watch those two shows, whether or not we like it or not. And by we, I mean Black folk, right? And they have to hit like a very kind of early 20th century benchmarks for acceptability and respectability, right? So I'm not arguing that we have to like everything just because a Black person makes it, or a Black person acts in it, or is the makeup artist or the gaffer or whatever, right? Like, we don't have to do that. However, we do not have to have the mindset of scarcity that we only have a couple of products and that we can engage with. And so if they're not showing us in the best light possible, then they're terrible, they're traumatic, they're pornographic, and so on. They may be those things, right? It might be an issue of taste, to your point, John, right? It might be an issue of taste, but it may also be an issue of like, everything ain't for everybody, right? So like Kinitra and I always talk about this, I'm a horror scaredy cat. There are certain things I'm not gonna watch, you know? So one of our fellow scholars, Tracy Salisbury, posted the other day on social media about something. She said, oh, this is for horror aficionados. And if you are scared, I said, oh, I already know. I don't even want to see the poster anymore, right? I don't do body horror, but you can give me ghosts, spirits, all that kind of stuff. That's great. I don't feel scared at all because I think those things are real. So there's that. But heads disconnecting but you know, all that kind of stuff, I'm not with it, right? And I know not to watch that. It may be trauma porn, it may not be trauma porn, but it's not necessarily trauma porn just because I don't like it, right? And I think we have to have like a critical, like engage with the systems and so on, rather than if Black folk are not at the end, you know, triumphant in these very specific ways. It's almost like we're using very retrograde, parochial language to talk about the art that we do because we're afraid that the art is going to go away, which makes sense because there are rises and falls, right? In the 1990s, in the 80s, there was a plethora of art happening in terms of the small screen and the larger screen, and then that went away. And I think folks are afraid of it going away again. And so we're like, it has to be perfect. And it's not going to be perfect. And that's okay. We also, not to ramble on, but we also have so many other avenues of production available to us. The internet has democratized in some ways art, right? So I may not be a part of Monkey Paw, right? But I have my iPhone 12 and I can make a movie on this and I can upload it to YouTube with other artists, right? And so when we talk about, well, this doesn't work, that doesn't work, there are all these great independent creators who are putting out things that we can watch that may be up to our level of art house cinema that we want, that is not going to be what we see on HBO Max or what have you. So I think there's a lot happening, but there's a scarcity mindset is, for me, one of the main issues.
I just want to really quickly, that's brilliant. I don't know if you saw my response to that, but like, I think that is exactly right, you know? Yes. The other thing was, and you hit on a couple of really great points. Like my wife, you know, will watch anything with a werewolf and a vampire, but if it's spirits and zombies, you know, she's like, nope, not messing with that, because she feels that zombies are real and that's going to happen, and so she does not engage with that. It's almost like, you know, you go to a film and it says like, hey, you know, this is going to have strobing lights in it and it might cause seizures, and if you're pregnant or if you're epileptic, don't go to it. And if you are pregnant and epileptic, you go to it, and then you say like, oh, this actually traumatized me. It's like, well, perhaps, you know, should not have engaged with that particular subject matter. My whole piece is that, you know, if you don't like that, if you don't like them, for instance, go check out Tales from the Loop, you know, which doesn't actually necessarily have a bunch of, you know, it has, you know, it's a diverse cast, but it's also executive produced by a Black woman. Go check that out, you know. So because we do have like a lot of options, and there are showrunners who are doing things that aren't necessarily, you know, we're not dealing with that. So I think that's all I have to say about it.
I want to thank you first again for opening up the space for this, and I think it's really important the language, in agreement with Susana, like what it is. And I think Ashley may have said this in her presentation earlier, like in terms of the monstrous and then how we choose to engage or enact with what is defined or demonstrated or seen or presented to us as monstrous. So I think the language is important, and there probably is a time when all of this needs to be defined and discussed very specifically, not only around people's tastes, but what they are able to engage with, particularly when we're talking about trauma, right? That because we're looking at images. You, in your question to me, the term conceptualize was used, and I immediately thought, well, there's an aspect of where Black people don't have to conceptualize this, because this is actually history. We go to a different space. It's a remembering, it is a re-experiencing, right? Which is a different type of trauma when one is viewing something, and that the preparation for it and the hiding from it is not of the lack of imagination or even imagination, but the reality of it, right? Because we have people in our families who may have or may not have survived lynchings, or may have or may not have been enslaved, right? So there are all of these things. And so I want to go back though to your very opening question before you got to our individual questions. I have 10 million things in my mind. I'm going to try to find the 3 that want to speak at this particular moment. And you asked the ending of this is, might Black horror like Lovecraft Country be healing also for white Americans and white Europeans, right? And so that is a question. Like my answer to that is, I don't know. That's something I feel that you have to ask white people, right? Because it is in the nature of viewing lynchings. I forget who said, maybe it was Leah who said that we know that watching things does not mean that they produce a different impact. It's either Leah or Alicia, does not provide a different impact, right? And we see that happening with lynching. So I don't know whether or not this is going to be something that provides healing for white people. That's something to ask white people. How are you interpreting this? How are you working with this? And is there a possibility? How can Black Gothic texts like Lovecraft explore some of the things that you asked me to talk about? And I did say, like, this is not a genre, any genre of horror that I like, but I found, like, even as a child, these were the things that I was watching, right? Because they were available on the 4:30 movie and, you know, with Vincent Price and all of those types of things, watching them. And I think that one of the things that Lovecraft Country does for us is it invites us to rethink, going back to what Kinitra says, right? I'm thinking about Kevin Quashie's new work, right, on Black being and the poetics of aliveness, that if we continue to frame these in limited language, right, and particularly the limited language of English, that it really prevents us from considering the other ways of being and the other ways of living, right? And for me, that's the answer. I came to this show looking for where were the possibilities for healing and the healing images, because that's what speculative, that's what even the Gothic, that's what horror offers us. And when the intent of the creators is in fact to choose, so that the differences in the book and the differences in the visual text are really telling where you go to choose or where you go to get the book of names, whether that's in the museum or whether that's back to quite literally living ancestors, is very, very important here, right? And what the choices are that have been made by a writer, by a director. You know, it's of course not perfect, but there's some deliberate choices in the intent of how one presents the information and how you are in fact inviting people to go back to get information that allows you to upturn all of this, even in terms of Epstein, right? Like, you know, whether or not he stays in the house and becomes friends, right? And so somebody asked the question about a white man writing this, right? That for me is a white man writing that you would become friends with your oppressor perhaps, or that you would be engaged with that. But somebody else writing that is like, no, I'm gonna get you out my house. Right? I'm gonna get you out my house. Like, there's no place for this particular kind of evil in my house. And so there's a lot more that, you know, that I'm you know, thinking about this, but I'll just stop there because I'm sure that, you know, you have some other things, but those are the things that come up immediately for me, and the possibilities with the genre and what it looks like when we make intentional choices to present certain things.
And I have to say, just the last word on Black trauma and horror. But I did a Twitter thread about Black horror, and I said that, you know, horror is the purposeful, controlled trafficking in trauma. It's like exposure therapy, right? It's like, you know, you're going to see some messed up stuff, but I'm going to present it to you in a way with a removal. And some people use that to help work through their own personal trauma. I know I have. and that it can be generative and helpful in that way. But again, it's not for everybody. So saying that it's not, that trauma doesn't happen, that trauma isn't a part of the conversation that it's not is untrue. It is, but it's not the center. It is not the only thing about it, and it's so much more complex than that. It's about, you must interact with the genre. And I also believe, and John and I talked a little bit about this, some of the folks creating horror now are not true horror fans. They're not aficionados. They don't love the genre. And they, you can see the sort of mechanics in, and there's always a trend, right? There are people who are going to get on it because it's a trend and they're going to make money off of it and they can get their material out there. But, it's not up to the quality, right? With Peele and Misha Green, you can see that they love the genre, right? So even with the problems that come up, and there are issues and problematic stances within their works, you can see their love for the genre and their deep knowledge of it. And I think that we have to look at that as well. Are some people out here just trying to make a buck?
Mm-hmm.
I think that says a lot, because when I think you do see the love, because even as someone who this is not necessarily my area, but I watch, right? Like I've been watching since I was a child, and that's it. It's again, the intent, the quality, the attention to what it is you want this work to do. Right? What is it that you want this work to do? And that in many ways is, your that question, again, Maisha, you changed it from when you read it from pornographic to excessive. And I was like, oh, okay, I like that. That is because I think how I feel about pornographic is in the same vein of John and Susana, right? But excessive. But then tell me what is excessive, right? Like I just finished watching Underground and the episode of the burning and the killing. Like what is excessive? Right. And then how do we, as viewers, and particularly of this history, I appreciated the fact that there was not the viewing of Emmett Till's body, but there was the smell on a hot day in Chicago. And then there's the Ouija board, right? And so there's these many very different ways in which they have selected to include multiple dimensions and voices, right? Because it's not, you don't have to talk about trauma in just one way, about the wounding of the body or the psychological. There are spiritual damages, right? There are all of these other things that happen. And so it's a very multi-dimensional way of addressing this issue, and very sensory, right? Like who wants to do, I mean, because, and that almost is more, more traumatic for you to think about, like the smell of a decaying body on a hot Chicago day, right? How does that sit with you? All right.
Yeah, thank you. Such rich conversation. Okay, so I'm going to I'm going to skip ahead because we're on the discussion of trauma. Beverly Thomas is asking, I am really concerned that the storytelling is about our past trauma and how we have been made subhuman. Can we not see something different? Maisha's group introduced me to Octavia Butler, otherworldly, more like this, rather than the constant reminders of our past limitations, which is seeping into current experiences. The good thing about these shows, however, is that they show us how some white people behave, however, without any resolution. It's frustrating. And so, yeah, I think the desire is, as Beverly is expressing it here, is a desire to see something different, right? Not to be repeating, I guess, the narratives of slavery, right? And I can see what she's saying. For a minute there, it seemed like Disney had a new slave narrative every year, right? All right, what's it gonna be this year, right? And so there's that sense of how these narratives of Black trauma have then been co-opted and appropriated and turned into popular consumables. So any thoughts on this?
I think there are several conversations going on here. Um, First of all, I think it's in, I can't watch 12 Years a Slave.
Mm.
I never have. I don't want to, because drama holds a hits differently with me. But I can watch Lovecraft Country, where my ancestors gonna take me into the their ancestral space filled with fire and show me how to fuck some shit up. I think there's a difference there. They're gonna teach me how to fight against. They're gonna give me the tools. I would also push against the word limitations. I never see those things as limitations. I see past traumatic things that have happened to us. But if they were limitations, we wouldn't be here. If they were limitations, we couldn't live and talk to and speak with our ancestors today. So, I refuse to take that in that way. And as for, are there other things to see? Yes. I think Susana just went through the plethora of offerings we have. If horror doesn't work for you, it doesn't work for you. But also, Susana, who just signed a deal to write a book about Octavia Butler herself, because she's awesome. If you read, Octavia Butler wrote Kindred, which is fucked up. She loses her arm. She gets whipped. Right? Octavia Butler, John and them are doing the Parable series. There are some people get raped, people are eating their feet. Come on, let's have a serious conversation about what's traumatic, how it's presented, and what's allowed to be traumatic and what isn't. Octavia Butler's presenting other worlds to have some very contemporary conversations and some hard ones. Right? I see Butler as far more traumatic than Amisha Green.
Yeah, Kindred is the scariest book. I mean, you're just like, Dana's in the shower, right? And she has a bag with her because she doesn't know if she's going to get snatched. I promise you, the first time I read the book, I was like, I'm flinging this across the room because this is utterly terrifying. Like, this ain't Fright Night. This is not Friday the 13th. It's not none of that, I think it's also thinking about, drama versus genre matters. I think genre matters in particular kinds of ways, right? And there are particular things that are going to be triggering for readers and viewers. I don't have a problem watching things about slavery, but they're not. I've seen 12 Years a Slave in the movie theater, and I've shown it in class. I used to teach a class, Slavery and the Literary Imagination. I've read slave narratives. I understand that I'm a strange person. Beloved is my favorite book, and I have a tattoo of a quote from Beloved, so I'm a weirdo. I get that.
You're not alone.
Although Beloved is a horror book anyway, so there's that. But there are ghosts and reclamations and exorcisms and all that kind of stuff. But again, I just want to reiterate what Kinitra brought up in terms of sort of re-envisioning who considers what limitations. You know what I mean? And just sort of lastly, white folk are working out their issues, right? In their horror as well. So there's some, if we think about, like, say, 80s horror, like cinematic horror, there's a lot of stuff around patriarchy and fear around sex in mainstream white horror, right? Just because we sort of universalize whiteness and sort of say, see, they're not dealing with their issues. What is it about all these scantily clad women who lose their virginity, in quotations, virginity is a construct, but whatever, have sex, and then they're immediately murdered? Right? There's something about white femininity that's being played out there. It's just that we don't talk about it in those ways, right? It seems ahistorical. It seems like, oh, they're just misogynistic or something like that. But misogyny is tied to white supremacy. It's white people's stuff, right? That they're working through, that we're all working through because we live in patriarchal societies, but they're working through their stuff. So I think part of the shift in thinking or in seeing is not misperceiving that, like, Black horror is about traumatic Black history and white horror or other mainstream forms of horror are just about universal aspects of humanity, like everyone's scared of the dark, everyone has mama issues. No, they are really working through specific cultural issues in their art, period. Right. We would say the same thing if we were talking about Korean horror, right? Like, oh, okay, they're working through specific things around, and of course, if it's a good movie or book or poem, we can take it universal, right? We can say, yeah, you know, this person didn't think of me when they created this film, but I can vibe with it because human to human, I get it. While at the same time recognizing the specificity of the cultural context. So I think we also have to sort of zoom out and say, white folk are working through their stuff with their boogie monsters too. Hereditary. What's that one where they're all in the daylight in the Nordic area? What is that one?
Oh, Midsummer.
White people stuff.
The Babadook.
The Babadook
fucked me up.
All of it, right? So they're working through their stuff too. It's not just people of color or marginalized folk highlighting their trauma. It's everyone's stuff is on display.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And I think that we're finally getting a chance to deal with these things. We like the embarrassment of riches also comes with these the spectrum of experiences, right? You know, everything is, and also too, we also have this issue of like shoving up everything wants to be Afrofuturist, right? Or Afro whatever, right? And we keep shoving all these different narratives, totally forgetting about the genre. Actually, it's one of my issues with these things. You know, do we just throw those away? You know, like Kindred to me is, like I said, Gothic, ethno-Gothic. It's not a science fiction story. It's not, you know, in fact, you know, Butler even refers to it as, a grim fantasy, right? Where she's dealing with these issues, you know, and having drawn those images personally, they are extremely affecting. I mean, like my shoulder still hurts from drawing those whipping scenes, you know. My tears were literally on the original art for that, you know, and I don't want to, I'm not relishing the fact of having to draw Parable of Talents right now. I've been putting it off. I'm designing characters right now, but I have to draw all of that stuff. So it's like, you know, the physical manifestation of those things are, you know, they haunt me, you know, seriously. Like those particular stories are extremely terrifying to me. And I don't know, I sort of said this in the chat, but I said I was far more terrified that Solomon Northup disappeared again than the stuff that I saw in 12 Years a Slave, because, you know, he still like was snatched or something, right? We don't know what happened to him at the end of it. People don't talk about that. He's like, there's a hole where Solomon Northup used to be. You know, we don't even know what happened to him. That is actually far more terrifying. I mean, I'm far more terrified by the fact that, you know, all the people who are perpetrating the horrible things that happen in our country and other worlds and other places are probably going to die, you know, old and rich. You know, that bothers me a lot more. You know, so you know, these are things that I'm dealing with. You know, as you know, in this particular space. So I don't know. Not to diminish people's trauma or to you know, I just feel like, yeah, I don't know.
I don't think it's a dimension, but I do find probably your question interesting. I think it's important because I think probably for the past 30, 35 years, all I write about is slavery. You know, I study slavery in a way that put me on a ship to retrace slave trade routes, right? Like I'm that experiential person. Like kindred is a real thing to me because when I think about the ancestral aspects of it, right? So this is another thing about thinking about something like Lovecraft Country. One of the responses that I heard often was people were really concerned about this conflict between Christianity and African religions, right? And practices, which I see your face, Kinitra, but this was a real thing. Like people were concerned about it in the same way that I saw writings about the Beyonce's, the extended video, people were complaining about that. Right? So in the same way, so there is a way that when we enter these text. So it's interesting that Holy Ghost begins in the church, right? And then you, as you go through that, you come through, you know, this exorcism and stuff, but there's a pushback in our communities, even against the ancestral, and that speaks to a longer history of enslavement and colonization and undoing and unlearning a whole lot of things. And I think one of the things that, you know, Beverly, thinking about your question, is like, am I going to continue writing about slavery? Like, I'm that person, not even though it's not horror, like I'm that person comfortable about writing a poem about the dismembering of Philando Castile's body so that it can be eaten as a rite of love, right? In the same way that one would consume the Eucharist, right? During communion, right? I'm that person. Am I going to write this for the rest of my life? Probably. But I'm also going to write love poems. And why will I write it for the rest of my life? Because that's a healing poem, right? No matter how horrible it is, it's a poem about healing. I'm going to write it for the rest of my life because the fact that we are even having this conversation about slavery, lynching, that these come into view, and that the way that people are able to enter it is through not necessarily drama, but through these genres that give them a little bit of a distance, is concerning to me, right? It's concerning that, you know, we have a textbook that tries to eliminate slavery and continue and conceptualizes, right, imagines enslaved people as laborers, right, the same way that they do at George Washington's plantation. When you go through there, the docents tell you the same thing, you know, they were servants, right? So until, for me, that we can actually be honest about this history and the impact of it, there's a need to address it in many ways. But again, it's not for everybody, and every way is not everyone's way. The thing for me is knowing what we're entering, how do we look at any of the texts and ask the question, what healing is it offering us? Does it offer us a point of entry to not only talk about the historical context and what has happened and what is happening to John and what happens to us as we're writing this, right? Because it is an embodied experience for us. This is, it is a history, no matter how it's coming through. Is there a point that we can use this to actually look at the ancestral, because African technology is one of travel, right? It's one of dimensional travel. It's one of going through. So when Letty goes to get that book, that this burning, right? Like this releasing, because when you burn, if you've ever been to Tulsa, right? If you've ever been to Tulsa, the marking on Tulsa as a city that was burned down is different than people who were drowned. It's different. And that releasing right there, but she could only do that because she could see the future, right? And within an African context, whether that's Yoruba, Akan, it's my working and the work that I do that people saw. If you've ever read, Ama's work, or like people saw, but you can't articulate it. Here is an opportunity in that scene that the future comes to you and it can articulate itself. So you can literally die and release and know that your descendants will be free. Just think about the Africans who died and worked and who couldn't even do that, even though they hoped for it, and maybe some did, but they couldn't. That's how, for me, I enter this text and allow it to be the healing, right? Right. So maybe I might be doing this with Ruby, but I'm there for Tulsa. Right?
Because someone asked about Afro-pessimism.
Yeah, actually, I was going to read that just now. So
okay, because I wanted to piggyback off of some of Dr. Abegunde's. Did you want to read the question, or did you?
Go ahead and read the question. So, all right. So Oliver Rendell asked, and this is directed at Kinitra, but I think everyone on the panel could answer this. I wonder if there is some nuance that separates Afro-pessimism from the Black nihilism and Black absurdism, which writers like Paul Beatty have presented as a way to radically rethink the concept of progress itself. Is this defeatism to you, or a potential way to escape the commercialization of trauma?
And some of the basic, I just wanted to talk about some of the basic issues with Afro-pessimism when talking about what we're talking about, when dealing with genre, when dealing with ancestral ideas, and to piggyback on Dr. Abegunde, for Black folks, death is not an end. It is simply a transition. So to construct the idea of Blackness on death completely runs counter to our understanding of it. I think even in terms of discussing things in terms of social death, if you add, an adjective, you're still not discussing the problems of us having a completely different understanding of death, right? Um, I think also with this, Dr. Sakina Young Skaggs, she said this wonderful thing. She said, do we want to be death dealing or life giving? And we're experiencing our lives through our ancestors. But I want to talk about when Dr. Abegunde said that Letty was brought to the past. But remember, she was brought to the past by George, who is in her belly by the future generation. So you had the past, the present, and the future all existing on the ancestral realm. Letty couldn't get there without the future in her belly, right? So there are some serious philosophical differences and understandings of these terms, and I refuse to take on the Western idea of what death means. So I refuse Afro-pessimism.
What you just said, Kinitra, yes, snaps, come on, because you preaching today. It's very Eurocentric.
So
Afro-pessimism is legit Eurocentric. It recenters, and not for nothing, it's very interesting to me where it becomes the critical lens. And there are Afro-pessimists, obviously, that whose work are very important to me, and I'm sure to the rest of folks on the panel, right? But the trendiness of Afro-pessimism, particularly among rising scholars, is another way, I think, and maybe I'm stepping on toes, but Kinitra has invited me to do so with this open salvo. It is how in the academy we use this phrase, Black bodies, bodies, or the Black body, right? And it's a way to not talk about Black people, right?
Yes.
And Black culture, Black sexualities, the various ways that Black people experience life. And I understand they're trying to question the concept of the human and the person. So it's not, I done read the books, I got it. But this idea that we are focused on death and it's very Eurocentric. And so the prefix Afro is a misnomer, right? It's really a way to engage in Eurocentrism, and oftentimes invites non-Black scholars in a type of solipsistic introspection. But because we have Afro as the prefix, we're talking about Black bodies, but I'm not a Black body. I am a Black person who exists in patriarchy and capitalism and white supremacy, all these things. I understand the category of the human is contested and all of that. I get it. Howsoever.
Yeah. It's like, let me accept all the things that white folks said about us as true and start from there. Like, you are subhuman. You are a body and not, and again, we've read it. Right. Some folks are smarter than others, and I think are doing something interesting. But when you talk about the gender dynamics, when you talk about the racial dynamics, when you talk about the pushing back against Black, there are not enough Black women who are Afro-pessimists for me to even really take it seriously. I just said that, and I'm done. All right, I fired the shot. It was me. I did it.
I was going to state that too. And it's like, if you look at the makeup of the creators who are working in Black speculative fiction, Black speculative culture, just look at the makeup of this panel. It's a very Black woman-led kind of movement, always has been, right? I mean, that's kind of where we are, which I love. I was going to say something too, because the wonderful Leela Taylor is actually in the piece too. If you read her book Darkly, if you haven't, but she was mentioning a couple of pieces. I have not seen Atlantic's. But I did see His House, which I am totally in love with. I just showed it in my class. It reminded me a lot of the dynamics of how monsters are used in the Babadook. If you remember, like the end of the Babadook, the monster is a signifier for grief and for trauma actually too, and the fact that they're feeding the beast, the Babadook, in the basement, and and are comfortable with it, right? The ending scene of His House reminded me so much of that. Like they had to go through those particular types of like monstrous things, to deal with the sin of stealing that little girl and then losing her, you know, in the water. I mean, oh my God, it was just harrowing. It's so harrowing, you know, and please check it out on Netflix. But it's like, it was dealing with the, you know, these particular issues of what it means to be a refugee in this space, and also be trapped and not understand the language, to be lost, and the mystical, almost mystical aspects of those particular type of oppressive systems. So this is like horror at its finest to me. You know, when you take those types of really, really complex situations that you really don't have the language for. You know, a lot of times I think, honestly, not to kind of praise the cat, but the idea of like Lovecraft's sense of awe, right? This notion of something that is inexplainable. You know, what happens when people of color, when Black folk take those different notions and redeploy them? You know, and that's what we've been seeing. And, you know, some good, some bad, but, you know, it's always a very interesting conversation, I think, when Black people or people from the diaspora get involved, you know, and we start shifting the conversation and the lens, so to speak. Excuse me. My throat is doing weird stuff, sorry. But yeah, I think definitely please engage with those. I have not seen Atlantic, so I need to check it out.
I want to just, I know that we're like at time kind of, but this is
a little over.
this is great. This is obviously like my dream panel to be just to say that. But I want to Susana, what you said about the Black body, I mean, I feel like I'm always revising or correcting people about that I'm not this body, like the whole. And I think I put a link for anybody who might be interested in Kevin Quashie's work, Black aliveness, because I think, or poetics of being, I think that's really important right now. I'm thinking about it. I think also that Catherine McKittrick's new book, Dear Science and Other Stories, is also in terms of my own discipline. But I think in not thinking about the wholeness of it, and even going way back to what Kinitra said when we began, I'm thinking about how Lovecraft offers an opportunity for somebody like me, right, who is obviously in a tradition that is so maligned, like beyond the zombie, but just how it shows up, like all over. And, you know, I'm accustomed to people crossing the street after they've crossed themselves often, like in cities, and walking in the opposite direction than they had planned to when they see me. It's a custom thing. But I think there's something about in Lovecraft, because the character who is the priestess comes in and she does call on the name of Oya, it moves it from me into for us to consider the religious sacredness, right? Like that lineage of Black practice, of that lineage of African practice. There's no contention between being in the church and catching the spirit, which is what's happening in that episode, right? And then getting the spirits. And I love the way that the calling of the names, which is something I talked about, is a libation of sorts, right? And so instead of this dismembering, right, we're going to get rid of Epstein, but what we're going to do is we're going to call you back into wholeness, right? We're going to call you back into wholeness by naming who you are in full, and invite you and to remind you, right, that you still have power, right? Like the spirit and the being as you come in has power. And it moves it out of that realm for me of just thinking about like magic, right? Magic is its own thing. But for African practitioners, right, and for those of us who are priests and come into this work in an ancestral priest and who work with the dead, right? That's my job, work with the dead, right? That this is not magic in the sense of how it's normally understood, right? This is sacred practice. So it becomes a sacred practice to bring the dead back into wholeness in the foundation of your house, to get, right, literally to get Satan, right, and however it is the demon of Epstein out of your house. But it helps us to reverse that, right? And that the priestess makes an offering of an animal in the beginning, as opposed to Tick, who's being offered like Christ is, right, to do something else, right? And we see those differences from beginning to end. So it's also an invitation to reconsider this African lineage of the sacredness of the body, the sacredness of the self, as part of a healing and reclaiming that from spirit and bringing the spirit together. So there are all sorts of things in here, right, that are possible in its working and helping us to heal and to move in and through and past the trauma if one wants to do that, right?
Thank you. Oh my goodness. Okay.
That's
so
wonderful.
One last, we gotta let y'all go home. I'll let y'all get out of the house, actually, probably put better. And we touched upon this earlier. I mean, John, you already mentioned the help. Abigail point out that, you know, this had to be written by a white dude because otherwise you wouldn't be making friends with Epstein's ghost. So David Powell asked, any thoughts from any of the panelists about a novel with centrally Black characters and experiences written by a white man versus the adaptation by a Black woman? Or what is a white dude doing writing this story? And thanks to Mr. Caruso for identifying this as white ventriloquism. So yeah, do you have any thoughts about, you know, the fact that this is an amazing series based on a book written by a white fella?
Start.
I'll start. So let's talk about which books get contracts and who gets chose and all of that, right? Because Black folk write stuff like this, and sometimes they get published, sometimes they publish themselves. There is a whole great slew of independent, speculative Black authors, right? Who write comics, who write short stories, short fiction novellas, and novels, right? And oftentimes we don't get to encounter them because they are not published by the Big Five or by Tor or what have you. Some of them do, some of them are. We can read Victor Laval, we can read P. Djeli Clark, we can read N.K. Jemisin, we can read, you know, we can read Butler, Delaney, all of that. But also, in general, white folk get more opportunities to do all kinds of different things. When I have not read the novel Lovecraft Country, I will admit to that. I don't read a lot of non-Black fiction these days. I don't have the time. But when, that was after getting the PhD in English and reading all the Hemingway and Austen and all, you know, I mean, forgive me. So I only have so much time these days. So then when I saw that it was getting greenlit at HBO, I was like, this is interesting. Jordan Peele's name was attached initially, like, you know, they put his name out front. But then when I saw it was Misha Green of Underground, I thought, okay, I rocks with Misha. What's Misha doing? I rock with Jordan Peele too, but I was like, a sister is at the helm. That's interesting. So I think about this question in light of, it to me seems like a very kind of Western project. And by what I mean by that, it's the hybrid of Black experience. Oftentimes, like let's take Wakanda, you know, and John, you can talk way more about this as like a comic illustrator, right? There are lots of things that were quote unquote started by white folk that then Black people take on. That is like the history of Black folk in the UK, across Europe, Canada, the United States, Central, South America, the Caribbean, wherever Black folks show up. Oftentimes non-Black people are doing things and we don't oftentimes get the opportunity to have that same level of exposure, right?
Right.
But we'll take it on.
Oh, yeah.
And we'll make it ours, right? So I have less of an issue with Misha Green doing that work because to all the comments that were made, and we talk about, you know, in my talk, I talked about the episode Holy Ghost because even though I'm an Afrofuturist and I really, you know, the episode with Hippolytus should be my favorite, Holy Ghost actually is my favorite because I'm all about, you know, so I sat there and watched it with my mom, who is a very Christian Jamaican lady. And when I make her watch this stuff with me, she's like, what's this demonic foolishness? Like, what are we watching? And in that episode, she was like, yes, that's how you do it. You call them, you use that verse, you do this. Yes, you anoint. Yes, when the lady got the goat, she was like, that's what you do. You anoint the, amen. She's doing it. Like, and it was such a profound moment of her and I just watching it together, you know, and she was not side-eyeing me for one. She was like, this is a good show. This is a documentary.
Right.
So when Black folks take stuff on, we make it our own, you know? We make it our own. So I'm more concerned when it is Black fishing, when there is cultural appropriation, but I don't really have issues with Black folk getting their foot in the door. And so, you know, maybe Matt Ruff got the opportunity and they adapted his stuff, but it's Misha Green's project now, in my eyes.
That's right.
I read the book, and she makes very specific changes that I think increases the Black agency, the Black women's agency, all of those things in it. The changes she makes are outstanding, and they're very intentional.
Very
I
nice.
think, you know, using John's term of remixing, like it's very much, she was very intentional in what she's doing. She knew what the hell she was doing with it.
Mm-hmm. And it's also extremely Gothic, right? Because not only does it have this notion of like, you know, the idea of revivalism, you know, actually taking these old tropes and topics and rejuxtaposing them, but the selection of music, the anachronism of the music to me was just mind blowing. I was like, I'm watching something really special, you know. And there's also this really beautiful appreciation of genre, you know. It felt like I was reading a pulp magazine, you know, like, what is this next story? It was an anthology to a certain degree, right? It's one particular connected story, but, you know, this, you know, after Holy Ghost, I mean, actually I think the episode after Holy Ghost was like the Indiana Jones episode, right? Where it's like, you know, it's like National Treasure. Very problematic episode, by the way it ended, which she regretted, you know. But also, you know, these different aspects of like, you know, the pulp aspects that generated, you know, Lovecraft's initial popularity. You know, he was writing for the masses, but he was using these ideas around atmosphere and monstrosity that really just weren't being deployed that way. But when you have someone's hands on it, like a Misha Green or like a, you know, Victor LaValle, you know, you see something very different. And that's why I keep thinking about this idea of racecraft in horror. I'm just kind of borrowing from the, you know, the book Racecraft, you know, where it's like these ideas are being deployed very differently, I think, you know, through that lens. So.
Well,
you're right. We did reclaim Wakanda. We colonized Wakanda.
That's
we can't have it back.
that is a good place to end. We could keep going with this all night, all day and all night. I mean, there's so much to explore in this series. I know we just got to the tip of the iceberg in this symposium. First, will y'all join me in a round of applause, thanking our keynote panelists? And let's also put in good energy to Linda. We're not sure what's happened to her. Let's hope she's doing okay. I know she wishes she could have been here. So yes, but thank you all. This has been so rich. And thank all of our attendees. I mean, I've been trying to keep track of the chat here, and every time I look over, it's like another 10 messages. You all have been absolutely phenomenal. So yes, thank you for making this such a rich and exciting symposium. Thank you, everyone. And I hope you have a beautiful day, rest of your day, for those of you that are at the end of your day like I am, and a beautiful whole of your day for those of you that are just starting. Have a wonderful time, and hopefully we'll see you all. Yes, in person, hopefully, or in capacity for future symposiums and conferences. Have a great time. Have a great night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye. Bye.